And I was the learning and development manager at the Waldorf Hotel in London, which was a wonderful experience. And then also became an employee of Business Link for London, which was like a consultancy for small businesses in London. It was government-sponsored small business consultancy, which was also great. And it was during that time that I actually did my studies to become, it's a postgraduate study to become a CIPD member. And because I was working at such a strategic level, I quickly was able to become a fellow as well. So that's really great. It's lovely. It's a prestigious organization. And then I knew I was meeting a particular standard of strategic thinking with it. And I set up my own business in 2004. And then 10 years later, in 2014, I started collaborating with my business partner, Ali Gibbons, and we set up Talent for Performance. So that's the current business that we now operate as. And we're a bigger team with a team of consultants, so we can take on bigger projects. It's very exciting. So I was doing some research about this, and we were talking, Vijay and I were talking about about collaboration. I thought, okay, let's just look at some stats. So it's interesting to say that 97% of workers believe lack of alignment with a team impacts the outcome of a task or project. That's a very high figure. So just think that if you get alignment within the team, it can have a massive improvement. Because 97% of the people think that it doesn't do that. 86% of workers cite lack of collaboration or ineffective communication as workplace failures. Again, these are shocking statistics. 50% say that their organization discuss organizational issues truthfully and effectively, which means that 50% believe that they don't do that. So notice the theme here is all about communication. 40% of employees believe that decision makers consistently failed to seek another opinion. And collaboration is all about sharing opinions. 40% of organizations lack a collaboration strategy altogether. And 39% of employees believe that their organizations don't collaborate enough. So there's a real desire for and push towards wanting to collaborate. 20 to 35% of value-added collaborations typically, but this is an interesting, typically only come from 3 to 5% of employees. So it's amazing, lots and lots of people want to collaborate, but who are the people who you really need to be collaborating with? Who are the people who are going to make a difference to the collaboration endeavor? This is saying that only 3 to 5% of employees do that. And then finally, this is an interesting one as well. 20% of organizational stars, right? Superstars, super performers, don't contribute to the success of colleagues after they've hit their own numbers. So that's not very collaborative. So there's a lot of research that's coming out that when we talk about it as if it's something that's the panacea of everything, but A, it's not happening enough, but B, when it happens, it sometimes doesn't happen very effectively. So let's explore why. But before we do that, I'd just like to know, we'll do a quick poll. So Ashke, if you're okay with actually with putting up the poll, what I'd like you to do is answer this question. How many teams are you a member of? And I'd like to just distinguish team, right? Because team, what I mean by team is a group of people who are working together to achieve a common goal. And how many different teams are you actually part of? Because it's just useful to look at that. I've done this exercise with many different folk and different organizations, and it's always interesting to see what the results are. So if it's none at all, you're a sole contributor, that's fine. You're just a sole contributor. And I think we're going to close the poll. So 80% of you have voted. So let's have a look. Will I just click on that? Okay, there you go. So you've done that. So just share those results. That's interesting in this particular group. It was very interesting to see how the different figures were rising and falling as more people answered. So the average is two teams, which I'm pleased to say is quite healthy. But look at the amount, 17% are more than 5 teams. Yeah. My question is, how on earth do you get your own job done? Because when you're a member of 5 different teams, that's 5 different sorts of team meetings you need to be attending. And that can be a huge burden on your brain and all that sort of thing. So I'd like you all to look just at where the teams that you're working in and the quality and level of participation or collaboration within that, and also who has influence within these teams. And let's explore why certain people might have more or less influence in a particular team. So thanks very much for that. What is your major challenge with regard to collaboration? Perspective differences, okay, lack of communication, yeah, drive for ownership, okay, return, mismatch. Okay, there's so many. It's nice. There's a big group and lots of participation, but I've run out of things that there's so many things that I want to write down. But that's great. Trustworthy time zone differences. Yeah, where in the global world, time zone differences can be very challenging. Great. Okay. So I can see that there's a lot of those things, and I've written down things like the first few that I saw, you know, around a lot around decision making, a lot around egos and styles. So let's talk about that. Power politics, as people have mentioned a couple of times as well, and lack of communication. So let's move on to a little brain science. I just want to talk a little bit about understanding threat responses in particular, but also reward responses, because it's important that we have a balance between the two. So, you know, without going into too much detail, it's really that, you know, we have this brain. We all have it, okay? Every human being. So everyone you're collaborating with has got this brain. And it's really interesting to know that there are, at the current count, about 80, from what the neuroscientists believe, 86 billion neurons within your brain. 86 billion, right? That's a lot of neurons. But not only are there that many neurons, each one is connected up to 1,000, if not, some people have said 15,000 times. So think about the figures of those multiplier effects, right? Compounding that. They say actually that there are, some scientists will say that there are more connections, not necessarily neurons, but more connections in your brain than there are stars in the universe. And some people even go further than that and say, well, it's actually not only the number of stars in the known universe, it's the amount of atoms in the known universe. And think about that, that's a huge figure. So we've got a lot of stuff going on in our heads. And what is it that drives these connections, right? These neural pathways? Because we are in fact born, compared to all the other creatures on the planet, about 2 years premature. We can't eat, we can't walk, we can't, you know, we're not able to really do anything for about 2 years. And yet all our behavior from the moment we're born is driven by two fundamental factors. And the first one is, well, what causes pain and causes discomfort? And the other is, well, what causes us a sense of reward or pleasure? And all of our brain waves are always guiding towards how to get more pleasure, avoid pain. They're the primary drivers. I know it's a bit simplistic, but they are the primary drivers. But they're what have led us to survive, to be able to be where we are today. And that's important to remember. Because if we look at it very simply, here's a very simple diagram of the brain. Now, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm drawing my mouse around the center of the brainstem there, which is the oldest ancient part of our brain. And if you notice that there are these two little parts which are quite close to it. So this is like our emotional, where a lot of our emotions and our sense of emotions come. This is all just reactions, right? Pure reflexes. But all this neocortex stuff is where we do a lot of our unconscious thinking or subconscious thinking. But here, this little bit of the prefrontal cortex, it's a small little thin bit, it's only 2 to 4% of our brain, is where we do pretty much all of our thinking, the prefrontal cortex. And it's important to recognize that, the prefrontal cortex, and it's very, very affected, either helped or hindered, by the amygdala, which I'm sure you're familiar with from the fight or flight response, and the ventral striatum, which is the reward response. And notice how close these are to our old ancient brain. They're very, very triggered by reflex actions and anything that might be a threat in our environment, or anything that might give us a fundamental reward for survival. So they're quite basic instinct. So if we look at this in another way, where we look at what we call the triadic brain model, where you've got your prefrontal cortex, which is all about emotional regulation. And it does that because it's called, also sometimes called the executive function. The prefrontal cortex is your executive function. And it does this. It does understanding, helping you understand things and put them together. Memorizing, remembering or recalling, decision-making, and this one I always find very interesting, inhibition. It helps you inhibit certain things. So if you want to be able to, I don't know, look after yourself better and go on a diet, if your prefrontal cortex gets a little bit tired, that inhibition is going to go away. And anybody who drinks alcohol knows that, you know, inhibition goes away when you drink alcohol. So it interferes with your decision making and your prefrontal cortex. But there are other things that interfere with as well. And daily life can be very taxing. So when you're doing all of these things, it actually begins to deplete the energy in your brain. Now, your brain, and especially your prefrontal cortex, is very energy hungry. I said earlier, it's about 3 or 4% of your brain, but it uses up to 80% of the brain's energy. And that energy can get depleted throughout the day. As you make more decisions, as you have to try and remember more, as you have to understand more. Any of you that speak a foreign language and then you go to a part of the world where that foreign language needs to be spoken, not your mother tongue, you often feel very drained at the end of the day because you've had to do so much thinking and understanding. So it's a great example of how just being in a foreign place can sometimes be very draining because it uses a lot of your prefrontal cortex. Now, the ventral striatum is then the bit around the dopamine reward system where I'll get a reward. It feels good, makes me curious and want more. How can I get more of this reward? That can boost your energy, but you have to be careful about how much you do that with that. And then you got the amygdala. The amygdala is all about threat response and safety. And all of these interact. And the amygdala in particular can rapidly drain energy and make you very narrow focused. And we're going to talk about some of the things that happen when we have what we call an amygdala hijack, where our amygdala gets triggered up and then all we do is go into fight and flight response. And that has a very serious impact, especially on these things, the executive function. It begins to deteriorate quite a lot. So the brain is a social organ. And I want to also mention from a collaborative point of view, it's really interesting to note that we've got two broad networks within the brain. There's the salient network, which is about all the connections that are made when we're on task, when we're doing something. And we're often doing things, right? We're little beings that do a lot of stuff. But whenever we're not focused on a specific task, the default network comes over. And that basically is whenever we're not on task, we're thinking about our social interactions. And they've done lots of different studies where they found that even if in a pause between tasks of just sometimes seconds, right? 5-10 seconds between doing one task and another in the lab, they'll see that the default network switches on where we're always thinking about other people, our relationships, what was said, what wasn't said, how people are interacting and all those sorts of things. So the brain is fundamentally a social organ. And that's one of the things that makes it so effective. And what I'd like to do is just show you how social we really are. If you just look at that word, and then I want to show you a picture of a vase, which I'm sure many of you have seen before. But what do you see when I show you that? Do you see the vase or do you see something else? And in many ways, it's fun to think about how easily we are primed, how easily we see faces in things, in objects, clouds or in a rock or on a bit of fruit, we'll see a face. So we're highly attuned. And there's even part of the brain which is focused on recognizing faces because it is so important for our survival to recognize faces. And another thing I want to mention from the social side on the neuroscience, which is interesting, is that there's a hormone called oxytocin. And I just want to mention that, where it's called a social hormone because it's actually produced massively in loving relationships. It gets produced, but also when during childbirth, so between mother and child, and between child and mother. And it actually helps to reduce stress massively. So childbirth's a very painful experience, and then the oxytocin helps to reduce that stress and to create a loving bond between humans, which also happens in loving relationships. But it also happens in other ways. And with regards to collaboration, I just want to mention that it also happens in crowds or in groups. But what we do is we create an in-group and an out-group. And it's worth noting that when you're in different teams, how sometimes that team will talk about other teams as them over there and us in here. So we become the in-group and they out there. Anybody who's not in the in-group becomes the out-group. And that can cause quite significant problems. Because when we have an in-group, and this is driven by oxytocin, when we have an in-group, we believe that the in-group is right, and that when a member of the in-group makes a statement, we're more likely to believe that statement as being a fact. We won't question it in the same way. Whereas someone from an out-group makes a statement, the first thing we're going to do is probably dismiss it as an untruth that needs to be checked and verified before we would believe it. So think about this around the teams, especially those of you who are in teams of, more than one. So two or more, a lot of you were in two, or most of you were in the two teams. But, what's the difference of energy and vibe, but also what's the power of that in-group sense within that team and the out-group sense within that team? And this can be expanded to, being part of an organization can make you an in-group. Oh, you're part of the same organization as me, therefore great. Or in the case of the photograph there, you're part of the same football team as me. Like, yay, we immediately have an affinity just because we like the same football team. but that creates quite a strong in-group bond. And sometimes if there's a particular rival football team, that can create a very quickly an out-group. And then bring that up to a social level where you can have whole groups of people, whole races of people having this in-group and out-group affair, which can really lead to a lot of social tension. So it's very important to be aware of how you and your brain may be misleading you about the truth when it comes to the in-group you're in and compared to the out-group you're in. Because if the out-group happens to have the truth and you're in the in-group that doesn't believe that, then that's when things can get very messy, especially when it comes to collaboration. So I also want to mention this notion of homophily. And I was just talking recently to a colleague about this, and it's really interesting because if we look at homophily, we can say let's say John is the leader of a team, and then he surrounds himself with people who agree with him and who he likes. So he recruits like himself, because he wants people who are, like him and know good stuff like he does. And then before you know it, he can actually create an organization or a team around himself that is very similar to John. So what might be some of the challenges with that? What might work well within that team and what might be difficult within that team? And the research is showing that there's a lot less conflict in a team like this, right? Because people agree, we see the same thing, we quickly get an in-group mentality, but there also becomes group think, but we'll talk about that in a second. There's also more satisfaction within these groups. They go, yeah, we're a good team, we're great, we know best, because there's lots of agreement about stuff, because people think the same, right? They're very alike and they think the same. They've got the same mindsets, habits, and behaviors. And it can be useful, right? I don't want to knock it just because it's very closed in its thinking. It can be very useful for very specific technical expertise. But that's when it ends, because in the modern world where we've got this pandemic and we've got these huge volatility in the economy and uncertainty in the economy and huge things going on, ambiguity and uncertainty, a team like this is not very agile, right? It's not able to think very much outside the box. It's not able to think broadly enough because everyone's in the same way. So if we then take an example of a difference, which would be, let's say Jane, call her Jane. Jane might then say, okay, I need to have diversity within the team. I need to have people who think differently and who challenge my thinking. So it's a much wiser approach for especially complex tasks, complex problem solving. And what we're finding is that a lot of organizations who have the homophily, like John, will actually go out of business quite quickly because they can't see beyond the realms of where their own thinking is. And that even got into the original financial crisis, where a lot of the very, very well paid big bankers were going like, nah, it's all great. We're owning loads of money. We must be really smart. We know the truth. And they didn't. But there are challenges with this, with Jane's group. And those challenges are potential for conflict because you're going to have a lot of disagreement. So you need to be able to deal with the discomfort of disagreement. So effective collaboration, really effective collaboration, seeks the truth because it has diversity, and diversity is uncomfortable, but it's excellent for complex problem solving. And I think that's the way of the world now. The world is complex and we need to have more diversity. A lot of businesses and organizations are crying out for more gender diversity, but cognitive diversity among everything else. Because if you have gender diversity, you will have cognitive diversity. And it's really important to be able to explore what is the composition of the teams that you're in and how can you collaborate more effectively with people who think really differently to you. So what needs to be in place for Jane's team to be effective? Well, it needs to be what we refer to as psychological safety. Now, psychological safety is often misunderstood. It's not about feeling all comfortable and nice and we're all really sweet to one another. It's knowing that I can say what I feel, I can say what I believe, and I'm not going to be exercised just for doing that. I can voice my opinion and it will be seen as a valid opinion which needs to be considered by the others in the group. Even if it's wrong, then I also will be able to have the psychological safety to be able to go, okay, I might be told why I'm wrong, but I won't be criticized or ridiculed for being wrong. I'll just be seen as a member of the team that's bringing some extra diversity to it. And that can only happen if there's trust. So part of what I would like you to consider is, what do you need in order to be able to bring that level of psychological safety to your teams and that level of trust by speaking up and checking that it is even safe to speak up. Especially if you're leading a team, it's really important that you bring that. So that the challenge is, where you've mentioned some of the things like power politics or big egos, that this becomes very, very challenging to bring this type of diversity. And there's a time and a place to have these conversations, but if enough people begin to have this conversation, then some people will need to see that it is actually possible to go, you know what, maybe you're right. We need to explore how we can become more diverse as a team. So one of the dangers with Jane's team, though, is if that continues, even if they have psychological safety, as time progresses, there's a very natural urge for people to join together and to build stronger relationships. So inevitably, even in that diverse team, you get a sort of beginning of collective thinking. And that might mean that some people form a core and other people simply leave. So all of this needs to be thought about and refreshed again and again and again. Otherwise, you can get into serious trouble. It needs to be constantly reviewed and say, are we being diverse enough? Are we inviting enough opinions from others so that we don't get into groupthink? What do we need to do to avoid groupthink? And, you know, going back to history a bit, it's interesting to see in politics. Now, it's also showing up today, but it's safer to talk about history. Is that, you know, Hitler, when he was invading the rest of Europe, after 1941, he actually removed independent thinkers from his advisors and only listened to people who agreed with him. So his information was based on advice he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to hear. And in the end, that had the whole system collapse inside. If you ever want to see how bad it got, there's an excellent film called Downfall. It's a German film, but it's very, very well done, about the last days in the bunker. He was completely just wanting to hear good stuff. He didn't want to hear from anybody else. And nobody was telling him. He surrounded himself with yes men. That was his problem, as well as lots of other problems. But Churchill, on the other hand, actually had a bad news department. He invited and recruited people who thought differently to him, including leaders of the general strike, who he could have seen as his biggest enemies, but yet he brought them into the fold because he wanted to hear their opinions so he could become wiser about what was really going on. Because he wanted honesty rather than just being said yes. And another great example is Abraham Lincoln, who brought in his political enemies to overcome major political issues. So let's have a look at building psychological safety, because we talked a bit about that. And generally the brain, pure survival mechanism, will always find a threat is much stronger than a reward. It's just the way we're wired, right? And they say actually that's 5 times stronger. So we have a threat response, which is 5 times more sensitive to a threat than it will be to a reward. So we need to be very conscious of this in the team and saying what's triggering people. And when we get triggered, our brain begins to get a very narrow focus. So we only zoom in on one tiny little thing. And it's often the wrong thing, because we actually make defensiveness. We say, what do I need to do to defend myself, to make sure that I'm right, so that I get to survive? And it's purely, it's very divisive as well. We make accidental connections. So we'll have different parts of our brain having different thoughts the way they normally do. But when we get a narrow focus and we get defensive and we get stressed, we'll have accidental thoughts and make it as if they're true. And they'll have a pessimistic bias. So we'll imagine that it's because something's wrong. So I'm speaking and maybe I've asked a question and nobody's answering and it's all very quiet. And I could imagine that you're all bored and you're all walking away and leaving the cat in front of the screen rather than listening. And then that will make me very nervous. And then I'll begin to stumble on my words and they go, oh no, it's all terrible. When in fact, that's just me making up a bunch of stuff. I've now done lots of webinars and I know that there isn't that much opportunity to respond. So we get a pessimistic bias, and then also we get less cognitive resource. As I said before, the prefrontal cortex, the bit of your front of your brain, is very energy hungry. And if any of that energy gets depleted, we just aren't able to understand, able to memorize, recall, able to make decisions or inhibit our behavior. And then everything goes out the window. So the SCARF model is useful to look at. It's all about status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Now, I like this model because it was developed by David Rock. And if you want to read more about it, you can just look up and research David Rock and the SCARF model. He's written a very good paper about it. But I refer to it a lot because it's so important in collaboration. A lot of the things that you mentioned around what the challenges were in collaboration have a lot to do with this model, where either if we have a threat response on these 5 issues, we want to exclude others. We don't want to belong with that group, or we want to exclude ourselves from, or exclude them from our group. But when we have a reward response, we actually want inclusion. We want to bring more people into that group and feel that goodness together. So it's really important when collaborating with others that we avoid triggering these things. They're like primary threats and triggers. So let's have a look. With status, we're always looking at everyone else in the room and figuring out where do we fit in the hierarchy. And if we feel a threat to our status, like we say something and someone goes, oh dear, that was a bit stupid, that's a huge drop to our status. And that can feel to our brain as if we were hit on the head with a stick. It's the same part of the brain that registers pain, registers a drop in status. And the pandemic is now affecting a lot of people's status, but also with any collaborative group. If people are juggling for status, that's not a good use of energy. And the thing that needs to be done to overcome it is to create a reward response. Is how can we as a team be better tomorrow than we were today? And if we constantly look to say, how can we as a team be better tomorrow? Or how can I as an individual contributor to this team be better tomorrow than I was today? We're comparing ourselves with ourselves rather than with others. So it's really important to have that self-reflection and saying, what do we need to do to be a better team? And that can allow a conversation to show up around psychological safety, around better contribution and openness to things. So the next one is certainty. And with certainty as well, we feel at the moment that there's very little certainty about it. We need to be able to move forward with that by making short-term plans. Because at the moment, any long-term planning is just going out the window. There's too much uncertainty to know what's going to happen in a month's time even. So maybe the teams need to be thinking, okay, what can we achieve in the next few days, the next week, and keep the timescales short? Because then at least we can say, right, I know that this week I'm going to be contributing to this team, and this team, or this team is going to be doing X, Y, and Z, have good to-do lists, have good plans, and good review systems and mechanisms. And then at least you can get some sense of certainty about what what's going to happen in the short term, because the long term is actually too difficult. And the same if you're leading a team, that you need to be able to map out and say, right, over the next week, this is our focus. We need to be able to focus on getting this, this, and this done. Keep it narrow, keep it tight. And that gives people a sense of certainty, which removes the threat response and gives more of a reward response, because they go, okay, I know this is going to happen next. And then they have more access to their brain. And the next one is autonomy. And that's really also during lockdown, that was freaking us all out because we were told to stay indoors. Who's telling us? Like the government is telling us that we're not allowed to go out. Are we now prisoners? And yes, at that time we were like prisoners at home. So that really freaked out our brains, because human beings must have a sense of choice. If they don't have a sense of choice, they'll get like rats in the corner and freak out. So the brain needs choice. And if you don't have much choice at the moment, find little things that you can choose from. So, talking with the team, talking with your colleagues who you're collaborating with, is to bring it into, so what are the choices we have ahead of us, and how are we going to go about making those choices? How are we going to make sure that everyone in the team has some say in that choice? Because otherwise your autonomy is curtailed. And when your autonomy is curtailed, you're going to feel that amygdala hijack, and you're going to go into all that negative stuff, which really narrows your thinking and also reduces and inhibits your decision making. So the next one is relatedness. And relatedness, as we've been talking about, the brain is a social organ. And relatedness is so powerful, because if we as humans feel that we've been rejected by our group, it brings up the same fear as our fundamental survival. We feel that part of us feels we could die. And that goes all the way back to, when we were running around in the savannah 70,000 years ago. If we're part of a little group, we weren't the strongest, fastest, or, the animal with the longest teeth and the biggest claws. We were actually quite frail. So if we were on our own, it was a very dangerous place. Survival, most humans only lived about 20, 30 years back then. So the thing is, you have to think around, relatedness is a fundamental human thing. And in the group, it's really important to have clear protocols and clear ways of relating, especially now with social distancing, that we find ways to communicate with one another via Zoom and like what we're doing now. Can't emphasize the importance of that enough. With good, effective collaboration is all about good relatedness within the team. And then the last one of these that I wanted to mention was fairness, that our brain is finely tuned to fairness. And it means that we need to be able to know what I'm doing and what I'm getting is fair compared to what you're doing and what you're getting. Because the only way that we'll have equity within the team, within the collaboration, is if everyone's pulling their weight. And it was interesting to see some of those statistics where only 3 to 5% of employees are effective at actively collaborating. So there's a lot of people who go, oh yeah, let's collaborate, i.e. I won't have to do much, other people will do the work. So you need to be choosing carefully who's really active in participating and contributing to the group. Because if that fairness isn't within the group, that's when the team falls apart. That's when the collaboration just doesn't work. Because people don't bother collaborating with people who aren't pulling their own weight. Because I know also I mentioned, a couple of you talked about accountability. And that's so important in collaboration, so that we can agree that you do your bit, I do my bit, and we both work together and we get that feeling that we're both contributing. Without that, it's just simply going to fall apart. So that was a quick ramble through a bit of brain science. And I just would like to open up the floor and say, any questions before we go into mindsets, habits, and behaviors? Because I'm aware of time and I want to keep it tight, but any questions up until now? No questions? Have I overwhelmed your brains? Is the personal identity affected as being a group member? I would say yes. I would say that your identity is massively affected by being a group member. So that's Dr. Priyanka. It's really interesting to think about how your identity is formed by the groups that you're part of. Yes, I would say game theory, cooperation is the best strategy compared to defection. I don't quite know what you mean by defection, but I would say that that means separating out. Cooperation is definitely the best strategy. It's why humans are so successful. Okay, I like the question there about how to make an extremely introvert team member to contribute. Those intellectual inputs are quite useful to the team. Sometimes that has to be in a quiet conversation after the group meeting, because sometimes for introverts, a group meeting is just a really intense environment, right? You get all these people playing their games and everyone's saying things. And if I'm introverted and more reflective, I have lots of brilliant stuff to speak, or brilliant stuff to contribute, but it's not comfortable for me to contribute. Because when I say it, maybe I'll get a bit nervous and maybe I won't articulate it in exactly the way I would like to. So a lot of ways to get the introverts out of their shell is to speak to them outside before or after the meetings, so that you can collect their stuff and then maybe speak on their behalf if that's the case. So that would be a suggestion. And how best to integrate into a new team is good. I'll talk about that in a second. How to become part of a team as an introvert. Okay, hopefully that's just answered. I've answered that question. It's about psychological safety, and it's about finding a mechanism where perhaps writing a couple of things down that you want to say and putting them in front of you, and then maybe it's about raising your hand or giving some other sort of signal, because you might be wanting to say something and go, but other people might not be seeing that because they're so busy trying to be right and trying to speak. And the world still favors extroverts. But how do you join a team was a question I saw earlier. Was again, introductions are really important. Whenever we have a new team member join our team, we always make sure that we talk about their background, we talk about what they've achieved, so that everybody can see that there's someone who has stuff to contribute. And in many ways, it's better if the leader of the team does that rather than you having to do it yourself, so that you have a platform, or that the leader helps integrate that into the team. So induction into a new team is vital, and it's a piece that's often missing. Many introverts have bright point of view. How to engage in discussion? Yeah, by encouragement, and it's also about managing the extroverts and saying, stop for a moment, everyone, just take a breath. Right, now let's hear from David, because I believe he has something to say. David, would you like to say that now, or would you prefer to maybe share it afterwards? And then create just an environment where it's easier to talk. Some people have two faces. That needs to be called out. That's a sort of almost separate conflict management conversation where people are being two-faced. That's a separate conversation with them outside going, excuse me, what's going on here? Why is this the case? Process-oriented culture, different by SOPs, very little scope for opening up, less process-oriented, but open to suggestion. Depends on the task you're trying to achieve. It's about which is better. There isn't a better. There's a what's appropriate for the context. What are you trying to achieve? Great. Okay, I think we're going to have to move on. Vijay, if you see anything else that's in there that's a pertinent question that you really think is valuable, that you would like to question, please bring it up. And otherwise, I've got to move on because
Sure,
I'm running out of time.
Yep.
Thanks.
In summary, I see that you have covered all the questions, actually.
Great. Okay. So a bit about mindsets, habits, and behaviors of influence. And it's influence in the context of collaboration, right? Because I wanted to bring those two things together because we've talked a lot about, what to do with big egos and all that sort of stuff. And I want you to remember that this all begins with influence, begins with your own attitude, because your attitude will influence and affect your behavior. And then your behavior affects my behavior. And then my behavior affects your attitude. And your attitude affects your behavior, which I bet you guessed it now, affects my attitude. So if you've got a problem with someone else because they've got a bad attitude, well, you can't change their attitude, but you can change your own. It has to begin with you. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to just introduce some models to you, which are really, I've found over the years, very, very powerful, but they can sort of make your brain hurt a little because understanding and taking on board a paradox. So I want to talk about the mindset of paradoxical thinking. But before we go any further, I'd just like you to drop into the webinar notes. What do you understand as a paradox? If I say, what is a paradox? What would you answer? Drop it in the text, in the chat. Ironical, opposites, great, okay. Yeah, opposites. I'm not sure about ironical, but opposites would be definitely true where the outcome or direction is not clear. Yeah, it's a lot to do with, well, which is it? Is it this or this? And the way we phrase it is ambiguous or absurd even. Yes, it can be absurd. Now all the answers are coming in. Paradox, two sets of opposites with complementary traits. Yay, very good. Paradox contradicts everything that has been said prior. Okay, it's more to do with these paradox two statements that appear to be oppositional or are contradictory, but are nevertheless both true. So all major governments around the world now have a huge paradox, right? Do we look after the health of the nation or do we look after the economy? And if they're in either or, they get very stuck. So they have to think about both and, but how on earth do you do that? Well, in my view, it's all about testing, and getting a testing regime up and running very, very fast. Not many countries are very good at doing that at the moment. And it's, it's got its challenges. I'm not pretending it's easy. But a paradox is being able to hold two contradictory or oppositional statements or traits in some cases that nevertheless are both true. So let's have a look at the paradox of opinions, of holding an opinion. How do you form and hold opinions, including how you deal with ambiguity? I'd like you to think about this in the context of some of the groups and teams you're in. Because if we take the two traits, one being certain, where certain is the tendency to feel confident in one's opinions and express them. And the other is open and reflective, the tendency to reflect on many different points of view. So that means that, okay, I can be open and reflective, I can take different, but I'm also, is that possible? Also certain? Well, let's have a look. If I'm very certain, I'm up here in this quadrant up here, top left, very certain, but not very open and reflective. I may be seen by others as being dogmatic. I know I'm right. It's about who's right and who's wrong. And I'm going to win that fight. But on the other side, oh yeah, and there are unintended consequences from that. So, you can imagine if someone's doing that a lot in the rooms, and some of you had mentioned that there are big egos where there's probably a bit of this involved, it can shut down other voices. And that's not helpful because then you get into that situation that, the little John homophily thing that I was talking about, where everybody begins to think the same and there's no dissent. That can seriously limit and inhibit collaboration and communication. But if we're very open and reflective, but don't express our opinions, or we're uncertain in our opinions, then we get to be seen as inconclusive, which can also be detrimental because then people are going, well, what does the leader think? Or what do you think, David? Because we need an answer to this and we can only go forward if we hear everyone's opinion. But if I'm not sharing my opinions, you might see me as inconclusive. And really what we're looking for is truth exploring, where it's not about who's right and who's wrong, but it's where's the truth and how can we better find the truth? How can we better explore the truth? And you get uncertain disinterest if you're low on both, which isn't very helpful. So the next one is the paradox of performance. Someone mentioned earlier about accountability, and this is about how you manage rapport and empathy when managing the performance of others. And that can include your peers. So if we have enforcing as the dynamic trait, in this case, how you push into the world, and warmth and empathy as the supportive trait, the tendency to express positive feelings towards others, and enforcing is the tendency to insist upon the rules being followed. If we're very high on enforcing and low on warmth and empathy, we can be seen as harsh. And again, that means that people will only work for you out of fear, or they'll only follow the leader or follow other people because of fear. And that's not great in the long run, because as soon as those people have an opportunity to go elsewhere or put their energy elsewhere, they will do that. But on the other hand, if you have a team where the collaboration is all very permissive, oh, well, I understand you didn't meet your deadlines, and yeah, I understand it's tough, and you got some in 5 other teams, and this team didn't manage to get anything done this month. That's not going to get you results either. So you need compassionate enforcing, where you've got agreement about consequences, agreement about building rapport and holding one another to account. And what we do is we actually work with teams and map the teams according to these paradoxes, which can be very powerful, because then we can see better the culture of the team and what to do about it. Because if you're being very permissive, then you need to hold people to account more. If you're being very enforcing, well, you need to ramp up the warmth and empathy to get over into this compassionate enforcing. And then the last one that I want to mention is the paradox of communication. And where are we there? The paradox of communication. There we go. Yep. How to manage directness and tactfulness when communicating with others. So in this case, we've got 2 traits. One which is frank, the tendency to be direct, straightforward, and to the point. Forthright. The other is diplomatic. They tend to state things in a diplomatic way. And we can see here that if we're very frank, and there's certain politicians that are great examples of this at the moment, and low on diplomacy, we can be seen as being very blunt. And that means that actually, again, we break rapport. It might be fine for some people. I'm honest, I'll tell the truth. If you can't handle the truth, well, that's your problem. But the thing is that a lot of people see that bluntness as rudeness, as unfair, and as hurtful, and therefore they won't collaborate to the same degree. But what's interesting is if you look at very high diplomatic people, where there's low frankness, they can be seen as evasive. They can be seen as someone who's not necessarily telling the truth, because they're saying a whole bunch of words, but like, what's the point? And then if you're seen as evasive, again, you can have people go, oh, yes, 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 we'll do whatever you said. And then they walk away and go, what exactly did David say? What exactly was he trying to say? So it can lead to a lot of confusion. And some people will not trust you because they think you're being untruthful. You're not telling the truth. So what we really need is forthright diplomacy, to be able to move things forward and to be able to do it in a way that takes people's feelings into consideration. And then if we have neither, it avoids communication. Now, just to illustrate this, I was working recently with a team, leadership team, and there were some issues between 2 of the team members. So we did this profile, we talked to them about what it is that their preferences were. And we've developed this thing called the communication diamond. It looks at these traits in a slightly different way. It looks at the top, you can see frank up there. So that's high frankness. And this is high diplomacy. So the center of this is 0, and it goes 1 to 10. And then it goes 0, 1 to 10 in this direction. But also what we look at as well and can measure is how much frankness do you want? How much do you need me to be frank and straightforward and to the point? Or how much diplomacy do you need? How much do you need me to say things in a tactful way so you can hear it better? And they are very important distinctions that are really very revealing, especially in any team that needs to collaborate and work, because one of the guys was low on frankness, or moderate, let's say, on frankness, but very high on diplomatic. So he was very diplomatic, but he wasn't necessarily very frank. But he also wanted diplomacy. He felt it was important to be polite and to be kind with people when you're speaking to them. And he didn't want much frankness. And of course, the person he was speaking to had a score that looked like this, where he was high on frankness and high on one's frankness. But he was also moderate on diplomacy and low on one's diplomacy. So here we have someone who's giving a lot of diplomacy to someone who doesn't want it. And here we've got someone who's giving a bunch of frankness to someone who doesn't want it. And that can be really unhelpful, because what happens is that these people then begin to think that the other person is rude or the other person is wishy-washy. And once you get into those sorts of labels, it's not helpful. The brain really needs to have clear distinctions and labels for things. And when you have a behavioral label like frankness, it's no longer rudeness, it's frankness. Let's talk about that being high frankness or low frankness, or diplomacy. And we're not labeling it and charging it with an emotional charge. We're just calling it what it is, which is a behavior. And that's already helping them go, you know what, this isn't a big deal. Luckily, it hasn't got too personal. So they're able to recover from it. But once things get very personal, this sort of thing, even when you know it, becomes very personal because the person is labeled because they've been scarfed, you know, SCARF. They've had all their, so, you know, their status has been harmed and their relationship is bad and they don't feel this other person gives them autonomy and all that sort of stuff, right? I've been talking very fast. I've been talking a lot, but I wanted to share so much with you guys, and girls, or ladies and gentlemen, I should say. So what questions do you have? I've got a thought. Let's have any questions. This can be hugely driven by culture. Absolutely, yes. How to achieve the perfect diamond? You know what? That's a really good question. What we've discovered is it's not a perfect diamond. I was going to illustrate it to you, but what we've discovered is that if you have a sort of high frankness, VJ, if you could keep an eye on the questions while I'm doing this bit, because I'm no longer looking at the questions.
Sure. I'm keeping an eye on that always.
Good. If so, someone asked, is there a perfect diamond, right? And what it is we found that it's a high frankness and a high diplomacy, so equally high, but also a relatively low once frankness or a moderate low once diplomacy. So it's a narrow type of diamond. Oops, if I can draw that there you can see there a bit clearly. It's that sort of diamond, right? Not like this, but actually like that, because that means that you're able to be diplomatic, you're able to be frank, and you don't really care too much about what other people do to you. That's the ideal. That's what we've discovered is the ideal. That person is often seen as an excellent communicator.
So can you give some key points to maintain the balanced approach?
Yeah, it's all about looking at what's missing. So for example, someone is just saying in the questions as well, is there not a tendency to confuse bluntness with dogmatism, right? So if I'm very certain, but if I'm very frank as well, then you get what we call a double whammy, because then you get that turbocharged effect of me not only being blunt, but being dogmatic as well. That is really, that's verging on becoming toxic, especially if you think about the other one that I talked about where you're harsh, right? Then you get someone who's harsh. So they're very enforcing, not empathic. They're dogmatic. They're very certain. I'm right, you're wrong, and not open and reflective. And then they're very frank and not diplomatic. Well, certain politicians come to mind is all I can say. And that can be toxic. They're the sorts of people who can destroy collaboration and destroy a team. They think they're right. They think they're being good. So what did you say about balance? Yeah, the balance for me is all about, if I go back to any of these paradoxes, the beauty of these paradoxes is that the answer is in getting the balance, right? So if we have people who are low on diplomatic, we say, hey, become more frank, and we can show you how to do that. It's a behavior. You just need to say very clearly, this is what I feel, this is what I mean, this is what I need to say. It tends to be easier to help, people who want to boost this supportive trait. It's easier to learn how to do this often than it is for people. Oh, something strange happened there. Than it is for people to learn how to become. So for diplomatic people, for frank people to become diplomatic can be a little more tricky than for diplomatic people to become frank. But I, for instance, when I first learned about this, found I was very diplomatic. I was a 10 on diplomacy. I was only 4 on frankness. So I've had to really exercise my frankness. What is frank? Frank is being straightforward, direct, and to the point, saying things in a very direct manner. Okay, very interesting about is it subjective? Okay, there's some subjectivity, but you know where the subjectivity comes from, Anu? It's really interesting. If I have a high once frankness, most people will come across as being too diplomatic for me. But if I have a very high once diplomacy, then someone who's very, very diplomatic will be just okay. But someone who's frank, even a little bit, will be like, oh, they're not so good. So it is subjective. And the subjectivity can be measured by how much once frankness and how much once diplomacy someone has, and then what's going on in their environment. So this is really important in teams, but also with leader and supervisor and manager. Mindedness versus mindfulness. I don't know quite what you mean by mindedness. I love mindfulness. I practice a lot of mindfulness, but I'm not sure what you mean by mindedness. Maybe it's being aware, having awareness. As traits or tendencies, frank and diplomatic, are not subjective. They are as objective as height of people. Okay, however,
David, I wrote that because we often have that debate of what is subjective and what is not. So when we look at something from measurement point of view, it is not subjective at all, because it is something an outside reality. Now, how that reality translates into behavior, how that reality translates into relationship, interaction between two people, that is totally subjective thing.
Exactly. I would agree. And, you know,
And
it's a really interesting debate.
Since I know Anu, I took the liberty to answer that.
Yeah. And you know what's really great about what you've just said? All of these tools, and, you know, there's a number of psychometricians on this, people who do psychometrics. I believe the power of the tool is to facilitate a meaningful conversation. Because if I'm able to have a chat with you and say, hey, frankness this and diplomacy that, we're then having a meaningful conversation to find out where we need to be so that we can collaborate effectively.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the power of this stuff. How high diplomatic can be high on frankness can go simultaneous. It'll go simultaneous because, for example, okay. High forthright diplomacy now is, okay, guys, you can stop asking the questions because we've run out of time and I'm so sorry. I really do want to keep on time. But no more questions from now on. Okay, and I'll just wrap up by saying these last couple of things as we run out of time. I'll just be very quick. The brain is a social organ. Remember, the default mode is you always thinking about your relationships. And be aware of oxytocin and how it shows up creating an in-group and an out-group, and that can be detrimental. And be aware of how easily we're triggered. Thanks, Vijay, for sharing this SCARF article. It's a great article written by David Rock. He's also written a great book called Your Brain at Work, which I highly recommend. It was the first book of neuroscience that I read. And, you know, collaboration and influence requires a balanced approach. It's about exploring the truth, compassionate enforcing, looking for mutual benefit, so both people win, and that forthright diplomacy. And then finally, so additional resources. I love sharing stuff with everyone. So you can contact me at david@talentforperformance.co.uk. That's our website there as well. Do connect with me on LinkedIn. A couple of you have already done that, which is really nice. Thanks for doing that. I love connecting with people on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn and you'll see my videos. I've just produced one today, which is really interesting, already getting loads of comments and views. So do watch what I'm doing on LinkedIn.
I love your videos, David. They are very precise. You know, kind of 1 to 3 minute and very to the point. Amazing. I love that.
Thank you very much. That's really sweet. So there's a free performance improvement resource page on our website. And you can see that under resources. Sign up to the T4P list. You can do that on our homepage, at the very bottom of our homepage. And please follow and connect on LinkedIn. It's always fun to do that. If you're interested in our Uplift program, that's for larger organizations needing to rethink and remodel the business from a strategic level, you can ask about that. And we also have the Performance Potential program, which is the mindsets, habits, and behaviors of success, where we look in much more detail at a lot of these paradoxes and help people to understand their own scores in them. And that can be delivered virtually. So we can run workshops on things like growth mindset, effective decisions, smart collaboration, conversational capacity, and raising accountability. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much. Last few words. How are you feeling? Choose one word that best describes how you feel. That's my last slide. Sorry, I've overrun by just a couple of minutes, but I'd love to hear. Any last thoughts? Oh, and if you like the webinar, another favor you could do for me would be to put a recommendation on LinkedIn, because I'm building a reputation for doing lots of webinars and being a guest speaker on webinars. And the more people who recommend me on LinkedIn, the better. Thank you. I'd really feel that. Yay, feeling great, enlightened, excited. Look at those words. Energetic, amazing, fantastic, super. Duracell power. I like it. Awesome, enlightened. Oh, I'd like to capture all those words. That's so nice. Thank you. Better informed and aware. Thank you. That's great. Yeah, great. And I believe we're going to be doing another webinar in August or something like that. Is that right, Vijay?
Yeah, and in that we will be we'll go a little deeper into the paradoxes.
Okay, cool.
What all of you have seen as a few example and glimpse today, we will go a little deeply into that.
Yeah, and I'll be able to speak a little bit longer about the implications of it. Good.
That is also going to be an amazing session.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you for your interactions. It's so nice to interact with everyone. And thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. Excellent. See you all soon. Bye-bye.